Hello everyone and welcome to Members Week 2021. I'm Meg, part of the V&A Membership Events team. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon. Today's talk is part of our Members Week celebration, where we're saying thank you to all of our members for your vital support over the past year with offers and events online and in the museum. So don't forget, we have 2 more free online talks after today on Wednesday and Thursday, and members do receive an extra 10% off in the shop until the 30th of May. And again, that's on site in the museum and online. So do head over to the website to book tickets for those talks or to make use of that extra discount. Now, before I hand over to this afternoon's speaker, just a few reminders for you. Jane will be taking questions at the end of her presentation. So if you have a question for her, please just pop that in the Q&A box in the bottom middle of your screen at any time throughout the talk. We'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. We are recording today, so if you miss anything or would like to watch again, you can do that. We'll send all ticket holders an email with a link to watch the recording in the next few days. And of course, Jane's talk today is in conjunction with her beautiful display on point, Royal Academy of Dance at 100. And we're so thrilled that the museum was able to reopen last week. So you can come and see the display in person in the theatre and performance galleries in the V&A. Just head to the website to book general museum entry tickets to come and see it. And finally, do make sure that you're keeping up to date with all the latest news from the museum by signing up to our weekly members e-newsletters. But now I would like to introduce our speaker for the afternoon, Jane Pritchard, who's the curator of On Point, the Royal Academy of Dance at 100. She's been the curator of dance at the V&A for the past 15 years, notably co-curated Diaghilev and the Golden Age of the Ballet Russe, as well as displays of the photography of Chris Nash and Anthony Crickmay. Prior to joining the Victoria and Albert Museum, she was the company archivist for Rambert, English National Ballet and London Contemporary Dance Theatre, and she was awarded an MBE for services to the arts in the 2014 New Year's Honours. So like me, I'm sure you can't wait to hear more from Jane about this gorgeous display, so I will hand over to you, Jane. Thank you so much for joining us.
Right, thank you very much. And yes, it is very exciting to be back open. We did have a little window of opening in December, which was very exciting, and then it was all taken away from us. So it's fantastic that now visitors can be back. We can go straight into the slides that's going to accompany this presentation and give you an idea of essentially what you will be seeing. So this is in the Theatre and Performance Gallery. Part of the gallery elsewhere is being sort of reorganized at the moment, but this is of course the area that you walk into, as most people will come into this area. So the display is in sort of 3 sections, just sort of geographically how the space works. And the first area is both about the present and the past. And I think that was terribly important. So essentially, we'll be showing footage of what the Royal Academy of Dance is doing today, alongside material that links to the founders. Now, the Royal Academy of Dance was not the first of the organisations to promote the teaching of dance, but it is the one that probably has the highest profile today. And December the 31st was its last December the 31st was officially the day of its centenary. Not a good day, given the state of affairs in this country, but nevertheless, we feel we were very proud to be open beforehand and also delighted that we are able to extend the display, so it'll be up during the year. So you will have plenty of time to come and see it. So as I say, essentially, if we move on to the next image, essentially, we are looking at an organisation that is centred around the teaching of dance. When it was established 100 years ago, the focus was very much on teaching teachers, very quickly then actually expanding to teach young pupils. And the focus was very strongly on ballet. In the last 25 years in particular, that has expanded an enormous amount. And so what I'm showing you here is the sort of the formal side, probably the side that people most closely associate generally with the Royal Academy of Dance. In this case, Alfreda Thorogood coaching at a summer school. On the other side of the screen, we have one of the more contemporary events. So this is actually taking place in India, and is a project which features very briefly in our opening film, which actually is to encourage boys to be interested in dance and girls to be interested in cricket. Now, you might say, well, that's a horribly sexist approach, but I think what it really is a case of getting young people together with different interests, but all fascinated by the idea of movement and using that. So I think that sort of element of sort of keeping things alive and perhaps sometimes introducing people to dance unwittingly is probably quite a good thing. So we'll move on to the next image. So I've included in the corner there shoes worn by Madeleine Genet, a great ballerina at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, who became the first of the presidents of the Royal Academy of Dance. We sort of begin and end our display with a pair of shoes, which somehow with dance does seem very appropriate. And I think for those of you who are interested in these things, to see the differences that come through in how the shoes even just look. They are less weighty in the past than they are today. But again, there's a sense of sort of fascination. And of course, a dancer's shoes, a dancer's footwear is very much part of the tools of the trade. So our visitor walks in and they see ahead of them the announcement on point. We have footage that's really sort of talking about the RAD today, and that's all fronted by their current president, that's Darcey Bussell, Dame Darcey Bussell. And we have these sort of what I've always called the snakes, on which we have various things mounted. This was partly because our designers were concerned, how do you get a sense of movement into a display on dance? So they sort of had this sort of sense of having something that was not sort of just sort of square on, and giving people the excuse to move around the space in a slightly different way. So the sense of fun. So I think that it was a nice idea that John Abbott and Dean Brown came up with. Also, in the display, you will notice a number of lines, and when they began sort of doing their research for the designs, they became particularly fascinated by Benesch notation, which is how dance can be recorded and written down. They actually went and did a workshop, and so the sense of lines in different way became part of the idea. We do include Benesch notation in the display, but I'm not actually going to go into that in great detail at this point. So moving on from that, we are looking initially at what was happening in dance at the very beginning of the century, so when the RAD came into existence. So if we could have the next image, please. On the opening panel, we've included the operatic syllabus. I should mention that at the time, so 100 years ago, it wasn't always referred to as ballet. We were sort of the operatic dancing. Historically, there is a logic because of the close link between opera and ballet, but it does sometimes cause confusion. So that's why it is an operatic syllabus. It is for dance, and that's the very first syllabus. And it was published in the Dancing Times in 1920. So next image. So looking at the area where we're sort of going back in time and considering what else was going on. So thinking there were teachers, there were important schools in existence, and by and large in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was a case of dancers being apprenticed. So there's a different approach coming in. The early 20th century saw huge changes in the dance scene in Britain. The arrival of the Russian dancers with Diaghilev's company, with Anna Pavlova, raised the status of ballet quite considerably. Often, dance teachers had just been used to opening their schools without having had any training of how to teach. So just sort of passing things on from one generation to another. But that too was also changing. And with the Russians came some very significant professional teachers. So we'll go into looking at them a little bit more closely later. But as I say, there was a lively dance scene. Indeed, I would say it was as lively as at any other time. It's a misnomer that prior to the Russians coming, there was no dance, no ballet in Britain. But having said that, a significant thing was with, if we move on to our next slide, the fact that Philip Richardson, who we see in the corner there, had taken on the Dancing Times. He bought the title and he turned it into a flourishing magazine, a magazine that is still a monthly to this very day. And he had a passion for ballroom dancing. And I think one mustn't underestimate the sort of the links that come between these things. In 1912, so 2 years after he'd started editing the Dancing Times, he attended this costume ball that we see at Covent Garden. So this was the Arabian Nights Ball. And one of the features of the ball was this farandole, so it was a line dance that was being presented that was staged by Edward Espinosa. Espinosa came from a family of dancers working largely on the continent, and then he was responsible for an enormous amount of choreography in musicals and pantomimes, but he was someone who was very concerned about what was happening to the training of dance teachers. And so Richardson and Espinosa met at this event, and which is why we sort of focus on it. I think it's a marvelous idea, and sort of had a number of discussions about what could be done to improve the teaching of dance, improve the teaching of ballet in particular. Richardson published a lot of sort of instruction sections in Dancing Times and gave advice. He also surveyed what was going on in dance teaching. So he would have a monthly column that would look at round the classes, which actually still continues today. But I think he was using it as well to discover the dance scene and the different styles of training. Now, the First World War intervened, so the sort of plans to improve training didn't take off quite as quickly as it might have done, but it wasn't that delayed. Richardson was also someone who was concerned that people involved in the world of dance should get to know one another. It wasn't a case of careers just going off in isolation. And so he set up a series of dancers' circles dinners at which they could mix socially and which ideas about dance could be put forward. And it was at one of these that he and Espinosa really put forward the idea of the need to improve the quality of training and to select for the next dinner the people he felt would lead that. But if we move on to my next image, I just want to acknowledge, as I said, there were some fabulous teachers working in London at this time, setting standards very definitely. And amongst those was the Russian dancer turned teacher, Serafina Astafieva. I think quite an eccentric woman, a fascinating woman in actual fact. And she opened her studio first in central London and then in the King's Road at the Pheasantry, really an artist complex. And also, very much at the same time, Enrico Cicchetti, who had worked very closely with Anna Pavlova and with the Ballet Russe, established his school in London. So that was actually also officially takes the date of 1920, but it was actually active long before then. So there were these new standards of professional teaching going on. And it's very much, I think, against that background that the Royal Academy of Dance comes into existence. Next image. So we have sort of the section on one of the walls, and then we move out and look at the people who were the founders. So we look a little bit more the work of Espinosa, who only remains with the RAD for a decade before going and setting up his own BBO, the British Ballet Organisation. And then there are 4 key women. And so we'll have a section on each of those. If we just look at those 4 women, we have the next slide. more or less in the center there, we have Adelaide Jane, who I've already mentioned. Now, she was a Danish-born dancer who had spent a lot of her career actually in Britain, dancing largely at the Empire and then subsequently at the London Coliseum. She was also in great demand internationally. She traveled to the United States, she traveled to Australia. So she was a very, very well-known ballerina at the time, a very charming dancer, and she had been trained by her uncle. So very much part of a family coming through there. And she would become the first president. She was very much an acknowledged star. She also becomes the first Dame of Dance. To her, and I can't do my left and rights, but if I go across the screen, first of all, before we have Jane, there is Tamara Kasavina, who was really the representation of the Russian school of dance. And this had really developed in the late 19th century and had become some of the finest training in the world. She's best known as a Diaghilev dancer. She was the ballerina in the pre-war years. She was also important for the company after the war. She was in Russia during that period. But she's always actually a guest artist with Diaghilev's company. And alongside her work with the Ballet Russe, she was also, in the early part of her career, returning to the imperial theatres and performing in Russia. And in the second half of her career, after she had left what had become the Soviet Union, she was undertaking a lot of independent activity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I would say it's interesting because this is 1920 is really a turning point in her career in many ways. She settles in Britain as her main place of residence. She was not somebody who had been heavily involved in teaching prior to this, but she does become particularly, I would say, a very important coach, and of course will provide a real sense of tradition in learning about classical ballet. After Jane, going across the screen, we have Lucia Comani, who is the least well-known of the founders. She was an Italian. She had worked a great deal. She had actually worked, first of all, early on in her career with the Espinosa family, and then at the Alhambra in London, where she taught and choreographed. And she had set up her own school by this time. And it's interesting, as I said, Richardson was going around and looking at different teachers. And I think he realized that she was probably the best available example of the Italian school to present. She was much older than the others in terms of sort of her career, and she only remained in Britain for about another 5 years. So she is the dancer founder who has probably the least of a profile. And finally, there is the younger dancer, Phyllis Bedell's, the British representative. It's nice to think that there was a sense of a British school in there from the start, but the way I look at it is, in fact, that in Britain, we were looking at what was the best out in the world. We were using people who had settled in London, having come from abroad, and we were benefiting from what they could teach us. The British then absorbed all that, and then they've sent it out into the world. So I've always seen, in terms of the story of the RAD, it's very much taking the best from the world and then sending it out again. So having that sense of transition coming through. But Bedell's had been a child ballerina before the days of the baby ballerinas, and would go on and have a very significant career as a teacher. Next image. We have included, and this is one of the things that I felt very sort of strongly about from the start, we've included as many costumes as we can. We know that the visitors to the V&A love seeing costumes, so we've made a point of having costumes representing all of the presidents, and we've got there 3 of the founders having their costumes. So looking across the case, first of all, there is a costume worn by Tamara Kasavina in Centenary, a solo, well, it was a group dance and then turned into a solo from her independent program. We have Adelaide Jane's Dryad costume, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We have Phyllis Bedell's debutante costume. This is for the mime section of that work. And I would acknowledge the fact that the V&A is very grateful to the fact that quite a long time ago, I think we're talking about 40 years, the RAD decided they didn't have the facilities for looking after costumes. So they passed over these costumes to the V&A. The final costume that you see there, the other side of the bar, so to speak, is a costume worn by dancers in the polka pizzicato with Anna Pavlova's company. And I deliberately included this because I wanted a reminder that there were the opportunities with the Ballet Russe, with Pavlova's company, with the little companies that people like Adelaine Chenet and Tamara Kasavina were setting up. There were opportunities for young British dancers to aspire to be in major and high-profile ballet companies. So it's a useful reminder, and it is a costume that was given ultimately to one of Pavlova's dancers and then reused for her displays when she put them on when she became a teacher. So there's that sense of how these things sort of evolve over time. But if we move on to my next image, a little close up on that dryad costume, the dryad, a spirit of oak. This was a little work, and I say little, it was a two-person production for Adelaine Chenet and a singer. Music by Dora Bright. And what I find absolutely fascinating is when you look at the costume. So we have the costume for 1907, which, think about it, this is Edwardian times. The bodice is very heavy and it has very different feel to the version that we have on display, which is a very much simpler tunic. So the impact that comes through with Isadora Duncan, with the Ballet Russe, to simplify costume, make the dancer much sort of freer, but also a reflection of how ballet costumes reflect fashion sort of coming through. So I just think it's a lovely little story that we can have around one of these costumes that we're showing. And if we have our next image, we do have a little section that reflects the sort of contemporary work of each of these sort of founders. So for Kasavina, the poster for the Colosseum, where she gave many of her London performances. There she's being partnered by Gavrilov, another former dancer from the Ballet Russe. There's also the programme for the Royal Opera House, actually for the opera. And this is in 1930 when, in fact, Kasavina arranged for some of the students, the senior students from the RAD, to be the opera ballet. So that sort of sense of bringing profession and teaching together. And then I've included 4 designs by Claude Lovett-Fraser. Next image. And I've deliberately put this sort of focus on Lovett-Fraser, because these are relatively recent acquisitions at the V&A, and also because it's the centenary of Lovett-Fraser's death next month. And so I sort of thought, right, then it was one way that we could pay tribute to a very, very great designer who has in the past, indeed 50 years ago, there was a major Lovett-Fraser exhibition at the V&A. But he's not somebody people are so aware of. And his very last designs were for Kasavina. In fact, that yellow dress, the polka dress, Kasavina actually wore when she was filmed, but alas, we've not been able to track down the film, but we know must be out. It'll turn up at some point. I'm very, very confident about these things. And just moving on to little images of Phyllis Bedell. So next slide. So there is Phyllis Bedell's teaching in her studio in Kilburn. So after she had retired from the stage in 1936. And I've also included there a photograph, not one that's actually in the display, but it's Bedell's dancing actually in 1921. So virtually at the moment, in fact, it's the very beginning of 1921. So it's the moment when the RAD comes into existence. And I think one of the things that's interesting, she is with Novikov. It's part of a production that Komorowski put on in London. And so it's at the moment really when Bedell's can really be seen to be taken seriously by sort of the Russian dance world, as well as being a very important British ballerina. So, as I say, the first section, we have film footage that brings things up to date and then looks at the founders. But if we move on to the next slide, we go into our second space. And this is very much focusing on teaching. And you'll see there, this was photographed actually when we were just opening in December, and we had to rope off our bar area. I understand that now you can actually go and do your exercises there, but we did feel that we needed to include something that resembled a dance studio. And either side of the area, set up actually with support from Harlequin, you've got little screens that give you some exercises. So it shows the RAD students performing them, and you can have a turn and have a go. So things are looking up in that sense. So in this second space, we are focusing on how teaching developed. So initially, as I said, it was teaching teachers how to teach ballet. Very quickly, there were classes for children, and this was obviously a very important element. And those sort of programs have evolved and changed, obviously, over the 100 years. So we are looking at that sort of development in this space. We're also, I mean, there's the lovely skeleton in the background. This is sort of giving the indication that things like anatomy become part of a dancer's training. It has become much wider. So moving on to the next image. In this area, we are trying to sort of cover an awful lot of subjects, but one of them is the RAD Production Club, so the Royal Academy of Dance Production Club. And really this wonderful statue of Harlequin, which was presented to the RAD by Stanislav Idzikovsky, himself a very famous interpreter of the role of Harlequin. So he gave this to the production club so that there would be a competition for the best choreography each year. Production club was important because it was one of the areas in which the professional dancer and the student dancer linked. The students were material for choreographers. There were also professional and aspiring choreographers. So, for example, John Cranko. We see the two photographs of John Cranko's children's tales. Firstly, how it was presented for the production club, and then secondly, for the Sadler's Wells Theatre Ballet. So moving on, but Cranko, Macmillan, Helpman, all these people had, Andre Howard had experience and opportunities to choreograph for the production club. The production club also was one of the areas where people could discover more about a range of dance. So there'd be lecture demonstrations on different styles of dance, Indian dance, Spanish dance, for example. So there were opportunities for the students and indeed for the members to learn more about dance. So the production club is one of our areas. Next slide. So I've mentioned teaching and of course exams. And so we have the poor pupil facing a quite determined band of examiners with actually Ninette de Valois sitting in the center there. And we have examples of the syllabi and syllabuses available, so people get an idea of how things have changed. There is also film footage that we include of exams and of teaching. And also there is film footage that goes with the next image, because in the 1950s, the RAD, as far as Britain was concerned, was one of the pioneering organizations that actually took on the idea that learning ballet could be useful for sports people. Now, this is an accepted idea now, but initially the idea was to improve sort of high jumping, athletics and things like that. And there again, we have film footage showing the classes, and we have the material for this little booklet, ballet exercises for athletes, that is illustrated by Fughese, who is best known, most widely known for his Careless Talk costs lives posters in the Second World War. So great fun, and actually to read it is very good. It's a wonderful little introduction to exercise. Perhaps it should be republished. Moving on to the next slide. We include also a sort of variety of perhaps less obvious things. We have a linguaphone record, which was for ballet terms. Ballet terminology is largely French, and so it was how the teachers and the students could learn to pronounce their French correctly. We also have little film strips, again, visual aids to help the teacher. And on the screen, you can see in the corner there, we have film footage made with Margot Fonteyn, actually presenting a new syllabus in the early 70s. And this is film footage that Eleanor Fitzgerald, the resources manager at the RAD, discovered in the run-up to this display. And one of the things that was really nice was actually the way the display is the bringing together the collections from the RAD and from the V&A. So it's very much a sort of a 50-50 in terms of the resources. Obviously, some of the more specifically RAD material has been lent by the RAD, for which we are very grateful. And it's wonderful to be able to show it alongside, particularly some of our less obvious and less well-known materials. So then the final element that we have in this room, and if we move on to the next slide, is we're looking at the galas that Margot Fonteyn presented. Now, Margot Fonteyn became the president of the RAD, the early 50s. Adelaine Genet retired, and I think it's wonderful the way Fonteyn talks about it in her autobiography. She sort of says that one day de Valois came along. De Valois was, of course, a vice president of the RAD. De Valois came along and said, it's been decided. You're going to be the next president of the RAD. No, would you like to be? Are you interested? You know, you will be. And apparently Fonteyn says that she was very nervous. She wasn't used to doing that sort of work at that time. And de Valois sort of calmed her down by saying, well, if you only have to turn up for about 2 events a year, it would not be a very onerous task. Now, one of the things that's really striking about the RAD, all their presidents have been very hands-on and very involved in what's going on. And I think Fonteyn quickly became fascinated by the opportunities that being the president gave her. And in the late 50s and the first half of the 60s, she put on a gala matinee each year to fundraise for the RAD. And this was an opportunity to bring in new dancers, new choreography, young designers. And here we see Philip Prowse's design for costume for Raymonda and Nadine Baylis's design for costume for, sorry, the first one was Paquita and the second one is Raymonda. Get there, okay. I think one could sort of guess that, want to look closely. So Philip Prowse for Paquita, and then the court ladies in the Nadine Baylis Raymonda, which was performed by Australian Ballet. So these were both productions that were staged by Rudolf Nureyev. So if we have the next image, Nureyev was one of the people that Fonteyn invited to come. He made his British debut at one of her galas, performing the poem Tragique, which you see in the bottom corner. And he was a great supporter of these galas and, of course, of Fonteyn's work. So after that first gala, they actually performed together each time. When he was first invited, he wanted to dance with Fonteyn, but she was already arranged to dance with John Gilpin, and so the partnership had to go on hold for a little while. But I've also included there, and we've included in this display, the costume that Nureyev wore for Swan Lake, and I'm very pleased to include it in this presentation in particular, because it was thanks to support from the Friends of the V&A that we were able to acquire this. So this was acquired about 10 years ago. No, yes, nearly 10 years ago, and it has been provided a wonderful opportunity for us to put it on display. So the galas were an important element. They broadened the interest, I think, of the range of dance. The Paul Taylor Company, for example, was first seen in Britain at one of these galas. There would also be opportunities for the students to perform. So they were very much a part of the dance calendar for the almost decade that they happened. So moving on from that to my next image, of course, we have to have one of Fontaine's costumes in, and so we've included the Sylphide costume. I've also included there just two little images sort of inserted, so you can see when we sort of set about putting on the display, you've then got to sort of get everything ready to be shown, and you can just see how the corsage was all sort of crumpled up, and the wonderful job that the V&A conservation team do to make the things absolutely wonderful. So the sort of opening up of the flowers for the corsage there. So with the costumes, we were determined to have as wide a range as possible, and also, I think, to give a sense of how dance costumes change over time, looking back, looking forward, and I think just generally using them to excite visitors. It always, they're sort of the element that most people are drawn to when they walk into one of these rooms. So if we move on to the final space, we of course have the permanent elephant box. So we've used that to project film footage actually of 3 of the presidents dancing and performing in the costumes that we have on display. So bringing those costumes to life. But the main element in this final space is really thinking about the RAD now. That map shows you how the spread of influence from the Royal Academy of Dance has gone worldwide. So from, as I said, a very small British organisation, it is now, the RAD is present in over 80 countries of the world. Initially, it was sort of working through the Commonwealth and then really having very much more expansion. We're also showing images that really give a sense of how the RAD has expanded its work in this country as well. So with the different sort of organizations, different programs that they have, Radiate, that helps the disadvantaged young people, also Step Into Dance, which works with particularly the sort of schools with boys, and then of course the Silver Swans for the seniors. So really sort of thinking about dance as pleasure as well as dance as training. But if we look at the next image, we're also looking at how the student world has developed and how each year there has been the Genet Medal awarded from 1931 onwards. So this is the international competition, and in this century it has become something that moves from one country to another rather than just taking place in London. So acknowledging really the importance of development throughout the world. We also look at the other sort of major award that is put out by the RAD, the Queen Elizabeth II Coronation Award. So the first patron had actually been Queen Mary. They had a royal charter from the 1930s onward, which really was important to give a seal of approval, I think. When Queen Mary died, then our current Queen, Queen Elizabeth, took over the patronage, and this award has been presented each year during her reign to somebody who has really contributed very significantly to dance. And so the recipients have, well, it started with, unsurprisingly, Ninette de Valois. It's gone through great performers, choreographers such as Peter Bright, dancers such as Carlos Acosta, and even it was given to Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret, who of course was a great supporter of the dance. Next image. So after Fontaine's death, Antoinette Sibley took over as president, and again I mean, as I said, all the presidents have been very hands-on. So here we see her in a demonstration class on adage. Again, I think with each of them, they have developed and helped bring the work up to date, but also given a profile. And I think very importantly, that link between profession and student has always been something that's been very significant. So really a role model for young dancers to aspire to. So if we move on to the next image. So for representing Sibley, we have her costume from the Peter Wright production of Marius Petipa work, The Sleeping Beauty. So we have the costume, we have the design by Lila de Nobili, we have a photograph of her dancing with Anthony Dow, and then of course there is film footage. So there is sort of the sense that if you're not necessarily wrapped up in the RAD, if you're interested in dance, if you're interested in theatre, you can see how the elements can be put together. Next slide. So at the end, we have our last three costumes. So there's the Nureyev Swan Lake in the middle. There's Sleeping Beauty for Antoinette Sibley. And of course, then there's Darcey Bussell's costume from the Prince of Pagodas. Prince of Pagodas was a very important work for Darcey Bussell, in that it was really the work that made her name. She was sort of discovered, if you like, by Sir Kenneth Macmillan and given the leading role. So she is Belle Rose. She has the mask over her eyes because there is a lot of symbolic use, both in terms of playing games with blindfolds, but also the sort of sense of becoming aware. So there is a whole symbolism that comes with that. So that was kindly lent to us by Darcey Bussell, who is of course the current president, and has taken a very active part actually in putting this display together. And just on to the next image. There we see Darcey in her costume, so it gives us a real sort of feel of it. And also we have, so this is the very beginning of her career with the Royal Ballet, and then her official farewell performance, or she's done subsequent dancing, her official farewell performance was in Song of the Earth, so another work by Kenneth Macmillan. And so, as I said, ballet shoes sort of bookend both ends of the display. So these are wonderfully worn, and when they were being looked at by our conservators, I said, we want them to look worn. It's part of what dance is about. So it is a time of great sort of development. As I say, the RAD has expanded into new areas, and at the moment it's just about to move into new premises. So if we just have the next slide. I've just put in there their current home, which is in Battersea Square. Also, the opening of that house, that building, by Her Majesty the Queen, and you see her there talking to Marie Rambert. Next to Rambert, of course, Ninette de Valois, and there next along is, in fact, Phyllis Bedell. So that sort of sense of continuing through. And I think that is one of the things that is striking about the RAD, is that there is very definitely a sense of continuity and development and evolution. Later this year, they'll be opening their new premises in Wandsworth Road. And so we have an artist's impression of how things are moving forward. So a major sort of birthday present, a new home. So that is a sort of sense of a whiz through the display. There are many things I haven't been able to show you. We don't have time. You just have to come and see it. That's very, very important. So the sense of this is how the RAD has moved on. It is still very, very significant in terms of training dancers, training teachers of dance, and encouraging almost everybody to want to dance. Thank you.
Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. And indeed, a whistle-stop tour through an amazing 100 years. There is so much to see in there. We have already got a comment from someone who has managed to get in just the 4 days that the museum has been open, who's really enjoyed it. So I hope everybody does have a chance to come and see it over the next few months while it's open. We will be going to questions now. A couple of you have already popped them in there, so do get your questions coming in for Jane. Before we move to the questions, I do just want to double check the blindfold that Darcey Bussell was dancing in. Could she see through that?
It is actually, it is a gauze. So yes, she can see through that. It is unusual for, if you've got to really dance, for anybody to really be completely blindfolded. Having said that, I will remember a performance of Sleeping Beauty where there is character blindfolded, and he did fall off the edge of the stage. So yes, no, I think certainly for the amount of dancing that Darcey was doing in that role, she would need to see where she was.
Yes, I mean, I wonder now if health and safety officers would perhaps have something to say about people dancing fully blindfolded. I think I'm not surprised that somebody managed to fall off the stage if they were doing it blindfolded. But I'll get to some of our member questions now. We've got one here about the costumes. You mentioned that one of the things that the display does is show how those costumes changed and how they were sort of influenced by changes that were going on in society over that 100 years. So one question we have here is, do the costumes reflect at all the changing physical shape of the dancers' bodies and any changes in the way that people expected dancers to look?
Yes, I do think that in terms of when you look at costumes, one of the things that always fascinates me with our collection of costumes, because it's such a rich collection, is actually where we have original versions and remakes, and so how the detail changes and how things do really, I mean, there is that sort of sense of length of skirt and things like that. The slim body, yes, there are a lot of changes that one can sort of get and understand from the costumes. I mean, I do think that we are very lucky. So although most of the Madeleine Genet costumes are very, very fragile, and it's just wonderful to be able to show a couple in the display. There's a lot of details in them that really help you understand about costume making 100 years ago. So little details that sometimes you read about in books and things. So for example, with the underskirts of the underlayers of when the tutus are sort of the sort of A shape, they quite often stitched the underlayers together for modesty. You didn't have high extension. But so there's extra elements that sort of come in, and suddenly to look at our costumes and see those details is actually very exciting.
That sounds amazing. I definitely would love to come in. I haven't had a chance to see the display myself yet, so I'm really excited to come in and take a closer look at some of these costumes and actually the shoes, and just to see how those shoes have been worn differently. Can you tell anything from different dancing styles by wearing the shoes at all?
Well, I think one of the things is that most of the block shoes now are much more blocked than they used to be. And that's partly because there is that sort of sense of, I think there is more sort of slightly more acrobatic elements, so people actually will be on point for longer. So they need a more secure base, if you like. I mean, what is quite fun is if you're there and you walk into the main part of our gallery as well, there are some other ballet shoes. There's one of Taglione's shoes on display, and those have no block at all. And that's the point when point work is really just coming in. So actually you can sort of see an evolution of shoes that comes through.
Well, sticking with the shoes, we have had a question about the shoes and the fact that they're the bookends to the exhibition. Of course, we have seen that there are some, costume sketches, and we see a little bit about costume design. Is there anything in there about the technique and the design of point shoes at all? Is that something that you can really look into?
We can't do everything in the in the display, so it's not a sort of a feature, and quite a number of the elements that we include there, I think, are people will sort of, people who are interested in certain areas will probably sort of pick out those sort of elements. We do actually also have some information about what dancers wore for class and things like that. So there's a wonderful sort of it's an unfolding booklet thing about what to wear for your exams and things like that. And I think one of the things that I think is sort of fascinating is that those sort of elements, along I think with having things like the bar, mean that people who've been, and so many people have been to dance classes at some point, and they may not have been RAD, they can be, you know, other organisations and things like that, but they will pick up and think, oh yeah, I do remember sort of doing this, or wearing one of those sort of little sort of hug me tight tops and things like that. So I think that although sometimes people think, oh, ballet is very specialist, I actually think there's quite a lot there that is also very generalist. And then also we've got one of the things I think is quite fun. It's David Dean, who actually taught costume to students at the RAD. He was also a wardrobe master in his own right. He drew some designs for a ballet that was being performed in Tokyo. And then this is before we can just whiz things back and forth. So we had to draw it all out and put all the instructions on it. And so it's all these sort of things you think, gosh, life is so much easier now than it was then. But it means that we have these wonderful sort of records of different approaches that are coming through. So yes, we're thinking about, he also did a wonderful series for the RAD Gazette on how to make ballet costumes, so that mums who had to make them or whatever had meticulous details of how it's done.
Amazing, that sounds fantastic. So I mean, you said you can't cover everything, but there is a lot in the display. It's a pretty extensive display. It does cover 100 years. And we have a question here from someone. The timeline has, of course, been impacted by COVID, but how long did it take to put this display together? How long have you been working on it?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that the RAD was very organised. And I think it was sort of 4 years before their centenary, they really started planning for it. And one of the things they said early on, locally, to, you know, within their own organisation, is that they would like some sort of display exhibition at the V&A if possible. And so they contacted us well in advance. So we really had a couple of years to put it together. I mean, initially you go through sort of general ideas. I think one of the things that's always fascinating when you're working with another organisation is that they obviously have their agenda and you have your agenda. Theirs was obviously to tell the history, their official history, and that's great. Mine was to make sure that it was broader, so that there would be things that people from other areas of, I mean, probably most people who make their way to Theatre and Performance Gallery have some interest in areas of performance. Of course, some people might just wander in, and that's great too. But I think the thing is that I was concerned that we would keep it as broad as possible. And so, for example, I showed you the Nadine Baylis design. Now, she's not an obvious designer for something like Raymonda. She did much more work with contemporary dance. So she was one of the key people who developed the use of lycra and all over body tights. So that's there. So we're putting in something that's a bit different alongside, actually, which I haven't shown you, the set that was by Ralph Koltai, who was much more associated really with drama and sort of developing. So I'm hoping that the sort of general theatre visitor will wander through, oh yeah, that's interesting, I never knew they did that, that sort of thing. But in terms of planning, we did have quite a good run-up time. It wasn't a last minute, oh, we must celebrate, as sometimes happens. And you know, it has been a great opportunity, as I say, to sort of marry areas of two collections together to really shed new light on things.
I mean, it is obviously a wonderful opportunity. You mentioned the V&A took on the costume collection from the RAD, and obviously we also have our own collections, and it is lovely to see how you've been able to bring our collection, the RAD's collection together, and obviously other objects from other places to tell the story. It looks it looks wonderful, very exciting. So going on a slightly different tack here, I hope you don't mind my asking, but we've had 2 people ask it. So a couple of members are wondering if you've obviously been involved with dance for many years. Did you take dance classes yourself when you were younger? Are you a dancer?
There's 2 answers there. I can't say I'm a dancer, but yes, I did do classes, and appropriately, I did do RAD classes. And I have still got my certificates to prove it.
Are they not on display in the exhibition, Jane? Surely they should have pride of place in there. So thanks so much, guys. We only have about 5 minutes left. We're going to try and get to as many of these questions as we can. We may not be able to get to them all, but we do have a question from one of our younger viewers, I assume today, who's aged 11. Obviously, you're tracking the development of the RAD as an organisation. When did it start to become really recognised worldwide and globally recognised as the kind of organisation that it is?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I think it actually took off really quite quickly. As I say, it was really initially going out to I think one can sort of say before the Second World War, quite a lot of Commonwealth countries would send dancers to Britain to train. And so then some of those and the links that they had would actually mean that the RAD became known in South Africa, in Australia, in Canada. Those were the sort of key places initially. And so it's become an international organisation quite quickly, I would say, really surprisingly quickly. I mean, the British are quite good at doing things like that. And as ballet has become of greater interest in, particularly, I would say, in Asia, that area has taken off quite significantly.
And of course, we saw that lovely picture at the beginning.
Gradual, and actually, if you go to and look at the big map that we've got on the wall, we do actually show how it expands through time. So we are trying to sort of give you that sort of information.
There you go. You'll have to come and look at the map on the wall to get the full answer of that. But thank you, Jane. That was great. Back to the shoes. The shoes are obviously a real point of interest for people. We have a question about ballet shoes. How many performances can a dancer wear one set of ballet shoes for before they have to retire?
It does depend what they are dancing. But if you're in a leading role, if you're in the ballerina role, you may need more than one pair of shoes if you're doing a multi-act ballet. You get through them very, very fast. In the leading dance companies, dancers will have an allocation of shoes actually comparable to their status within the company. So it's a pretty hierarchical element that comes in here. But it does really rather depend. And dancers will find that although they go to the same maker for their shoes, there will be certain ones that are really comfortable. They'll also find ones, oh, these are very good for balancing. I'll keep them for that role, and those sort of things. A lot of attention is given to shoes, but dancers can get through. I mean, it's not unusual to get through, you know, a pair for a performance. It does depend what they're doing.
That's amazing. I'm not a dancer myself. I don't know if that's obvious, but it's incredible. I mean, I'm sort of aware that the shoes tend to wear out quickly, but I had no idea it would be just one night could do a pair in. We're coming to the end now, so I'll probably just ask one more question, which is there anything that you wish you could have included in the display which you just couldn't fit in, you couldn't track it down, you couldn't find it?
I mean, it's always one of those things that you have to compromise and work out. I think there are certain approaches that I was interested in considering taking, and I wanted in a way to do more individual stories when we started out, and I would still like to have done that, because I think that's always a way of bringing it to life, but it can get complicated, and I think that we have managed to get a very good range of material there. I think that to me it's important that we have got the costumes, we've got photographs, we've got designs, we've got film footage, we've got, you know, I do think that the range is excellent, and sometimes, you know, you start off with your wish list, and when there's two of you, you've both got wish lists as to what you want. I think by and large, there's not any one object that I think, oh, I would love to have included that. And when you're looking at the costumes and things, I've always said that when you're deciding what goes in, you're auditioning the costumes for a display, because how much work has got to be done on them for putting them on display and things like that. It's not just we take them off a hanger and bung them on a mannequin. There's hours of work go into, and what I'm always delighted about is that if we put on display costumes that have not been on display, sort of within more or less living memory, and that is true of most of the ones. There's only a couple that have been displayed before. You are extending their life, and you're showing people things that they didn't know we had. So I can't say I've got one thing I wish I could have put in that's not there. There's one thing I wish we could find out who the sculptor was of the of the bust of Espinosa. I think, oh, this is so annoying. We haven't got there. So perhaps one of our visitors will suddenly come along and let us know, and that's always great too. We love having extra information.
Well, there you go. I hope everybody who's watched the talk is able to go in and gold star to anybody who can identify the sculpture of the Espinosa bust. We are out of time, so I will just say, Jane, thank you so much for joining us and talking us through this beautiful display. I hope everyone has a chance to come and see it. It is going to be open until September 2021, I believe, so everyone has a few more months to come. Thank you to all of our members for all of your support, for joining us today, and we absolutely cannot wait to welcome you back into the buildings now that the museum is open again. So I do hope you're all taking the opportunity to come and visit whenever you're able to. And as the sun has just come out here in the area of London that I'm in, it seems a great time for everybody to be able to get out from behind their screens and go outside and enjoy some sunshine. So I will leave it there. Thank you, Jane, and thank you everybody else for joining us.
Thank you.